Okay, it's 11:01. I see that the number of participants is still a bit increasing, but in the matter of time, I think it's good that we start. It's a great pleasure and honor really to chair this debate for the next hour. We've got a lot to discuss. Hello to everyone in the audience and also the participants of the workshop. The topic we have chosen is quite challenging. It's the big question, will this time be different? Lessons from the European economic and financial responses to the crisis and future prospects. And I'm thrilled to host two distinguished speakers for this debate. I think both of them make an excellent job in bridging insights from political science and economics and also reaching out to a wider audience to engage with the policy debate, which is not always an easy thing to do both at the same time. So they truly combine scientific excellence and policy advice, share their policy insights. Luckily, our speakers are well-known figures, so that I will try to keep my introduction brief with my apologies that I cannot elaborate on all of your achievements. Let me first welcome our guest, of course, Vivien and Schmidt, who is a Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration, Professor of International Relations in the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies and Professor of Political Science at Boston University. And she's also the founding director of Boston University Center for the Study of Europe. Vivien is a leading figure really on the debate on the EU as a polity, and one of the few specialists, I would say, who never forget about the big picture. However tempting it would be to dive into her areas of specialism, which include, amongst other things, EMU, comparative capitalism, and are therefore highly relevant for the topics of our workshop. Vivien has also made a very visible theoretical contribution on the debate on legitimacy, which is also, of course, also policy relevant, and I'm sure we'll hear about it today, and discursive institutionalism. She has published her latest book very shortly before the pandemic hit Europe. It's entitled Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone. And I've attended some of her events launching the book, and it has become, in a way, a discussion of the new unfolding crisis, of course, so the COVID-19 crisis, which enriched, of course, this discussion, but was also a challenge. Let me further introduce Ayan, Pieter, Kranen, with apologies that I will be slightly shorter here because I think everyone knows sort of from the safe audience, Ayan, of course, very well. He's very active, especially also in the policy debate. So he is the scientific director of the Leibniz Institute for Financial Research, SAFE, and professor of finance at Goethe University's House of Finance. His current research interests focus on the implications also of the previous crisis. So again, the question this time different. We've really two specialists who looked at the previous crisis in depth. He has looked at the effects for banking, for systemic risk, for financial market regulation. And as I said already, Jan has shared his expertise in many advisory functions, both at a national and EU level. I cannot enumerate all of them. So he's really ideally suited also to bridge the academic and policy divide. And if you have the time to look at some of the SAFE policy publications, you will see he has engaged, as we've also discussed yesterday, in the ongoing debate about BaFin's independence and the Wirecard scandal. He's very actively engaged in the debate on the Capital Markets Union, on non-performing loans, Corona and banking, and many more topics. So both of you have intervened very early in the debate when the crisis hit Europe, and I have looked at your early interventions as a starting point to see a bit, you know, what did you say back then and how do you see things now, as if we were sort of time traveling. So Vivien, in an intervention published on 23rd of March, so that was very early throughout the process, basically said, and that was before, of course, the ECB intervened, and we've seen Next Generation EU, it's to some extent Euro crisis all over again, right? So she was sort of very, well, maybe we can say anxious it would happen again. And Jan and colleagues in a SAFE policy letter published in March 2020 entitled Corona and Financial Stability 2.0, Act Jointly Now, but also think about tomorrow. I think it's a very catchy title. Made some interesting observations, which I would like to take as a starting point, because they also resonate with yesterday's keynote lecture provided by Lucia, who's also in the audience. So they were asking three questions, or looking at three aspects. They first of all looked at the size of the crisis response. They looked at the timing of crisis response and the nature of support measures. And against the backdrop of these three criteria that you have identified as sort of key benchmarks early on, let me ask you, as a first round of questions, how, after more than 1 year into the pandemic, how do you assess the EU responses to the COVID-19 crisis? Was it timely? Was it big enough? And was it adequate? And I would pass on to Jan to start first, and then we continue with Vivien for a first round of reflections. Thank you.
So thank you, Sandra, for the very nice introduction and also for inviting me. I think this is a debate I really look forward. We have not talked before, Vivien and I, so it's not that we are now playing out a playbook, but we are really interacting live. And I think this is, for me, this is particularly interesting because after so many decades of work in finance and economics, and later, in the later years also, with a strong emphasis on political dialogue, I've always felt that we miss political science in our thinking, in our models, in all the way we are doing even policy advisory work in financial economics. It's mostly about I think the strength of our discipline. It's about market forces, what drives the big animal economy to respond to particular actions, which is almost like a natural body that has its own logic. So we are basically analyzing this logic of the economic body. And we think a lot when we talk about design issues, which we will also discuss today, I think. We think a lot about incentive compatibility, so about the inherent logic of institutions vis-a-vis outside interventions. And so these are the two things I think where financial economics does a lot and can contribute, but there are many others that we miss out on, and particularly this is the political world, political decision making, and the term legitimacy was already mentioned. So aspects that are not in our models, typically not in our thinking. And I guess that this is more the focus of what Vivien is doing. And in that sense, I really look forward whether there's some match. So the first question that Sandra posed to me is to take a look at the responses that have been done at the EU level. So I will do first a short, let's say, comparison. What Sandra also mentioned, that I have been thinking a lot about GFC, global financial crisis, and the aftermath. And I think it's useful to compare these two crises, and not going into the detail, but the general, let's say, mechanism, the general environment. And so let me start with a sentence on the GFC. The global financial crisis, let's say 2007, 2008, was really starting by a hit at financial intermediaries. Our whole intermediation sector was hit by a shock, and that you can elaborate on how this was done. But in a sense, it was first the financial sector that was hit, and at a later stage, other sectors of the economy were hit largely because, and that's the main, I would say, lesson from the global financial crisis, we need the banking system and other parts of the financial system as a vital network that supports the economy in whatever it does. And if this is somehow interrupted or endangered, or there is illiquidity or so forth and so forth, then the whole economy cannot work any more smoothly. And that has huge consequences. So the real impact of the crisis, if you wish, but it comes, so to speak, at a second step, right? The first step is the banking system goes down, then comes the economy. And if the banking system is hit strong enough, there is no other solution than a full government support of the banking system. We have to stabilize the banking system. We have to fund it, whatever is needed. You have to bail it out at a big scale. That's what was happening in the global financial crisis. There was a response to this, and maybe I have later possibilities to speak a little bit about that, but that response has completely reinvented, redesigned, re-engineered the banking system and the larger other parts of the financial system that really today look different from how they looked in 2005. And the whole, let's say, the bold idea was, how can we separate, in some sense, the banking system from the taxpayer? So make it more taxpayer independent, right? Make it more self-sustained, and in that sense, more sustainable. Now comes COVID. COVID is a different story because the shock didn't hit the banking system at all. It hit the economy directly, right? And there are many ways how it did it. It hit individual firms. It hit entire sectors. Let's say the transport sector, tourism, services, mostly because of lockdowns that happened not only serially, but also sequentially. It started somewhere and then it continued. But since we have global supply chains, the shock was transmitted via various channels, not only via the lockdown itself, but even also via supply chain interruptions at some other places. So workers were hit, consumers were hit, supply chain, I said that already. And since all these institutions or actors in the economy have some relation to the banking system, indirectly, the banking system was also hit. So there was, in a way, a long discussion about NPLs, non-performing loans. There was a long discussion about debt overhang, so that companies might be over-indebted given the loss of cash flow that they have. There was a talk about zombification, so that companies continue to exist because they have funding from the banks, but are no longer viable, really. And there was a discussion about delayed technological change because of, let's say, lack of power of the banking system to actively engage in new lending. So that was, in a way, the indirect link that also was, or at least could have, hit the banking system. That was the story. And back in March 2020, that's what we told also. That was this indirect effect to the banking system. Of course, this has not talked about the response. The response by governments all over the world, but also here in Europe, of course, in a particular way, was to shield the banking system from any consequence that it may experience in the logic that I just explained. So basically giving cash directly to those that otherwise would fall back onto the banking system, the firms and the households. And through this mechanism, banks were not really affected, and they continued lending. So the whole support engine or the whole liquidity that the economy needs was there all the time. There was not much, let's say, shock transmission that had anything to do with the banking system. Now, a few words on the response themselves. The response to COVID, so I noted it was big time government money injection, right? So a lot of government money was flowing in the private and also in the public sector, basically almost fully, in some countries at least, substituting for the fall of earnings or turnover that happened during the lockdown. There was a long debate about what type of shock do we have? Is this a shock that will quickly be over? We call this a V-shaped recovery. Is it a shock that will last forever? Would be an L-shaped recovery. no recovery in a way, or is it K-shaped? It comes back, but some areas don't, right? And that is more or less where we today settle most. It's a K-shaped recovery. It comes back quickly for some industries, for others it doesn't, right? And or takes longer, and there you may have problems in the sequel. The injections of government money were basically at the firm level. Mostly it was loans. Sometimes it was grants. Sometimes it was equity. And in the paper that Sandra mentioned, we were heavily arguing in favor of equity rather than loans, because loans increase these problems that fall back on the banking sector and so forth. But that was mostly not followed. So in public action. The most important contribution really came, at least in a country like Germany, from automatic stabilizers that kicked in immediately. In other countries, they had to be constructed anew. Furlough schemes I'm talking about mostly. That was the most important government assistance in the crisis, quantity-wise. And it was introduced in many countries in different ways. But in a country like ours, it is an automatic stabilizer. Nothing had to be done. It was working via Kurzarbeit schemes immediately. In other countries, tax checks were used, but everything outside the banking system. The volume was massive, but with high variation across countries, and thereby accentuating differences between rich and poor countries quite a bit. So OECD countries, typically about 1/3 of GDP, annual GDP, was the size of the assistance. In emerging economies was like 10%, like a third of this, and in poor countries was like 2%. So a tenth of what was being able to give in the OECD countries. I think the most important lesson that we take from this observation is that the response that we observed, which was almost always a national response, was a direct function of fiscal space that existed in these countries, and it was defined at the national level. And now, that's my last 2 bullet points on my small list, is the Next Government EU program, which is basically the invention, if you wish, of the crisis at the EU level, which is sizable in volume, is the most visible attempt to organize some level of transfer between countries. Right? And so otherwise, everything has been national, and that's where fiscal space matters. Now comes NGEU, so then the Next Generation EU program, which is actually using largely existing EU structures. It has not been institutionalized, but it is basically the only way to create new fiscal space that one could use for building back the economies at the national level. I'm not speaking now any further about the ECB program, which was just mentioned in the last discussion, the PEP program or anything, because that was mainly not a funding instrument, but it was an instrument to keep the market afloat, keep interest funding rates of banks relatively low, but there was no direct impact on crisis funding through this program. Okay, so maybe I stop here. And
yeah, thank you very much, Jan, for sharing your sort of recalling the different sequence of the 2 crises. So where did the financial sector play a role, how it was affected as opposed to the real sector? And I think you also really sketched out the different levels of responses and emphasized a lot that most of it was still national, and that fiscal space is an important element in this, briefly talking about Next Generation EU. So I'd like to ask Vivien, against the background of this analysis, is this time different? I know you're less negative than in your first response, but it's still a nuanced assessment as far as I can see it. So I look forward to hear your response to the question. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Sandra, and thank you all. I'm delighted to be here, and I found all of your presentations fascinating, and so I refer to a couple of them as I go on. And so thanks, Sandra, for referring to my March 2020 Social Europe piece. That was as the book went to press, and all I could do to refer to the crisis was change the first line of the preface, which read something like, the Eurozone crisis is arguably the worst crisis that the EU has ever had, or maybe it was for the past decade. And all I could do was put in, with the exception of the COVID-19 crisis, the Eurozone crisis was the worst. That's all I could do in the book as it went off to be printed. But it's quite clearly at that moment, I was really worried about the COVID-19 crisis being a déjà vu of the Eurozone. I should say that I have a more recent, I think a couple months ago, Social Europe piece where I'm now take as a given that there's been this good response, actually much more than I think any of us anticipated at the time, and also call for much more to be done. But if you think about in March 2020, at the time, in terms of legitimacy, but just simply in terms of governance, the council was unaccountable. The ECB refused to act, but then shifted very quickly. The Commission was missing in action, and the European Parliament was nowhere. But importantly, this changed very quickly. Before I talk about that, I want to respond just very briefly to Sandra's questions about size, timing, and adequacy. So, is the COVID-19 response big enough? Well, clearly not in economic terms, as Lucia noted yesterday, but we do need to consider the multiplier effects, the shift toward greening the economy and digitizing communities, and possibly addressing social inequalities. For the private sector, we could say this changes the psychology. I think it changes business perceptions, a sense that growth is not only possible, but necessary, and here's the direction to go, that it needs to be green and digital. But most importantly, and this is more my domain, or this is also my domain, it was a game changer politically and symbolically by breaking the debt taboo and moving toward deeper integration in EMU. Obviously not far enough, and probably not adequate, but still major shift. Was it timely enough? Again, not really in terms of the economic response, but certainly compared to the Eurozone crisis. Let's remember, there were 9 months to even respond to the Greek crisis, then 2 years to stop market attacks, which happened only when Draghi, with Draghi's famous statement, "I'll do whatever it takes to save the euro." And thank goodness the banks and the markets didn't pay attention to within my mandate, but just assumed that this was the ECB saying that it really was a lender of last resort, even though, don't tell anyone, it kind of isn't. But it took 7 years then to incrementally reinterpret the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact in order first to switch to growth and then flexibility. So overall, we're talking about a decade to shift economic policy, and that really only comes with COVID-19. And this is important, not simply for the economics, but also political perceptions and public opinion. Here we see an important shift. Just take the case of Italy, and we've, in the presentations, there was a number of references to Italy. March, April, May 2020 felt like an abandonment, even a betrayal by the EU. Lack of solidarity as PPE exports were forbidden, as the Dutch finance minister blames Italy for not investing in its hospitals. How outrageous could you be given the informal conditionality and Stability and Growth Pact rules that had made it impossible for Italy to invest over the long term? And even though the Dutch finance minister was roundly condemned, it gave, I think, everyone probably in Southern Europe a sense of a lack of solidarity or empathy. So there was a talk earlier about the European, about the EMS. on health-related funds that there was no take-up. If you just look at Italy, there's a clear sense of deep mistrust of conditionality. Yes, everyone said it's just minimal conditionality. Well, no amount of conditionality was going to make the Italians think that this wasn't, some kind of way into forcing Italy to do things that it couldn't or wouldn't do. And of course, this became a political crisis in Italy as well, in particular for the Five-Star Movement, opposed to taking it up, and government falls at Renzi. Anyway, we don't want to go into that. But June and July bring a certain kind of redemption, despite the Frugal Four Plus challenging the Franco-German and Commission proposal for large amounts of grants. But nonetheless, it's important to see that once the deal was made, you see opinion polls, and I think Francesco shows this, even in the Frugal Four, the opinion polls were not necessarily behind the leaders, as one would have expected, but rather was for this kind of shift. Did this help push the EU forward? Certainly. The NGEU, the Next Generation EU, was a major shift in approach in funding, but also in the EU's economic guidance for all the member states. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of the European semester, because as part of it within the NGEU, so it's not just the RRF, the Resilience and Recovery Fund, but the NGEU within the European semester means that national economies with the capacity, Northern Europe, will be spending more in these areas, while those without the capacity, or at least financial capacity, will be getting infusions from the Resilience and Recovery Funds. So I'm going to shift now, also because I think it's useful as a political scientist, and given the kinds of things discussed, I want to talk about policy change and what this means. And so here we could sort of take this within the context of a historical institutionalist framework and ask, the question would be, was this kind of change incremental or a paradigm shift, or status quo or reversal? And also, do we see integration deepening, further differentiating, reversing, or no change? And I think certainly with the COVID-19, this is a major break with the past, a major shift from the path-dependent trajectory that the Eurozone crisis seemed to have. And so I think I'm on safe ground to say this is something of a paradigmatic shift in terms of EU-level debt going toward deeper European integration. However, that said, this is only a temporary recovery fund. It doesn't provide the permanence of a Hamiltonian moment, if you will. There's major change in policy instruments, but we have not yet seen lasting change in core ideas. So that's on policy change. In terms of EU governance during the process, how do we explain it? So if you go to traditional intergovernmentalists who use a rational choice institutionalist framework, there's a focus, they focus on the Franco-German initiative and negotiations on the European Recovery Fund. And here, the analysis is all about interest-based bargaining with a lopsided battle between the Frugal Four and the Franco-German leaders, as these two larger countries impose their preferences despite concessions. So that gives you a kind of very parsimonious encapsulation, which probably doesn't capture the full, what was going on. And here we could add the new intergovernmentalists who use constructivism or discursive institutionalism, i.e. importance of ideas and discourse, the interactive processes of discourse. And here we'll add to, I'm not going to give up on interest-based bargaining, but say one also needs to see these negotiations as deliberative interactions, consensus-seeking debate and contestation leading to an agreement. And here we can point to the persuasive ability of French President Macron to convince Merkel to change her ideas. And here you see then innovative ideas by the Franco-German couple moving against the old ideas of the frugal four, which are more in keeping with, the kind of ordo-liberal, neoliberal stability rules. But beyond that, we could also look at the interventions of the European Council President Charles Michel, working through the night to conclude negotiations, despairing of solution, turning to the Italian Prime Minister, Conte, who's still awake enough in the wee hours to come up with the acceptable phrasing to clinch the deal. Okay, what does that mean? It's that there's a lot of contingency here, but also leadership actors make a difference. But importantly, this is not just about intergovernmental actors. The supranationalists have a lot to say about this, both in terms of historical institutionalist and discursive institutionalist account. But this is not simply, as the traditional intergovernmentalists would say, the council seeking to take back control from the commission and trying to reduce commission power. No, on the contrary, the council, whether you want to call it interest-based or deliberative negotiation, then turn to the commission for it to elaborate its ideas, including on the European Recovery Fund, which then charges the commission to administer. And we see innovation coming from the commission on the Recovery and Resilience Fund as it ups the ante. We could also point to the work it did during the slow burning phase of the Eurozone crisis to develop new ideas, some of which were layered on incrementally, but the more path-breaking ideas had to wait until COVID-19 to be taken up, such as, the greening the economy, digitalizing, et cetera. And finally, even the European Parliament plays a role in terms of budget rule of law discussion. So it takes a while, but they're in there as well. So one could argue that whereas in the Eurozone crisis, this was really negative politicization and excessive intergovernmentalism, in the COVID-19 crisis, we see a new political dynamics of interaction, leading arguably to more positive politicization, even if there's some negative related to the frugal four plus. So basically, I'm not sure how much time you want me to continue talking. I have a lot more to say here, but I mean, it's important then to note that the pandemic response represents a new beginning. If you look at the Eurozone crisis, instead of, in the Eurozone crisis, instead of providing some form of debt forgiveness and mutual risk sharing instruments, the EU reinforced the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact. Mandating austerity and structural reform policies overseen through the European semester. The Eurozone engaged in governing by rules and ruling by numbers with the wrong rules and numbers, which didn't work, which led to what I have called the EU's crisis of legitimacy, in which doubling down on the procedural rules, which created problems with throughput legitimacy in terms of accountability, transparency, efficacy, led to poor economic performance, problems with output legitimacy, and increasingly toxic politics, i.e. problems of input legitimacy. And we could argue that even though after 2019, things improved, the economics in particular, as the rules were applied, as more and more flexibly, the damage had been done, as we can see with the rise of populism. And so the pandemic response really, I think, is tremendously important for what it did in terms of breaking the taboos against EU level rules on deficit and debt. And beyond that, sort of responding, I think, to sort of citizen desire to resolve the Eurozone crisis, among other things. And I guess I'm going to end on this. We already see a change with a return of the state. This is yet another, if we want to get into notions of capitalism. We see the state at the EU level with a deepening economic integration of the EU through the Recovery Fund and EU level debt, but also an importance of the return of the state at the national level to guide investment and arguably to address inequalities, economic and social, that have been fueling populism. And I guess the question, and I'll be ending with this, is this the end of neoliberalism? with the move to industrial policy and state capitalism, or what Matthias Goldman yesterday referred to as integrated capitalism. But I guess how much neoliberalism is still baked into the assumptions? For example, about what constitutes structural reform, as in Amy's paper this morning, with regard to unions, as they're pushed to increase their flexibility in Southern Europe. And what about the rationalization of the welfare state? So, we've got to ask ourselves, this is a new European semester that's more bottom up than top down, but there's still conditionality. There's still a push, so that some would argue that the investment state is not incompatible with the austerity state when it comes to labor and welfare. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Vivien. I think you make my job really easy to sort of go to the question of longer term implications for the EU, because you already sort of touched upon it. But I think you covered so much ground. Of course, there was a bit of political science jargon in it. I hope Jan is happy to respond to that. So I think I'd also like to give Jan a chance to react to these really very encompassing reflections. I mean, of course, you've mentioned that next generation EU for you, Jan, is not as important economically speaking, and I think we as political scientists agree, but now Vivien made a case that it's politically and symbolically important. That's of course something which is more sort of in the realm of our discipline, that it is a game changer in terms of deeper integration. I think that is an important statement. And on the second point about how speedy it was, she argued, of course, it was maybe not fast enough, but still faster, and there was some sort of redemption in the course. I really like that. We also have a few questions later on in the chat, which I would like to pick up on, but let's first pass on the word to Jan to respond to, well, some of them also provoking reflections maybe about the end of of the neoliberal age, as Vivien argued. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think this, in that sense, I would say it's an optimistic outlook that Vivien is giving. I wouldn't share that fully, because I think that we still don't know what NGO really is. So the discussion, the debate, I would say even the fight about its institutional structure has just begun. It's an idea, and it's for the time being, it's temporary. It's a one-off funding scheme. It is basically, it has a redistributive element in it. So Italy gets much more than it will contribute in the end. So there is a grant component on the EU level, but most of the money is in the end paid back by the Italians. In the case of Italy, this is not really true, but for all the other countries, it's mostly a lending scheme that has been added on top of what the EU budget typically is. If there is no, in the institutional sense, there are no own resources forthcoming, which is still to be seen whether they are able to create own resources by which they could raise tax money to pay back the loan, then it will be paid back out of the usual budget. And it was nothing than a short fire that we have seen, straw fire, so to speak. Nevertheless, I see the symbolic character of it, just as you. I also think people start to think about something. And in my earlier remark, I said it's about fiscal space. And we have all realized in the GFC, we realized that how vital it is to have a banking system that functions smoothly and that does not depend on taxpayers' bailout. And we know now how difficult it is to get there. And in the next crisis, I think, has taught us we need fiscal space. And the debate is now just starting what that means. And in my opinion, it doesn't simply mean we need debt to come from some place and then the fiscal space is there. But fiscal space has, in a way, an exposed and an ex-ante dimension. Exposed, it is we have a crisis, we need money, we have to create it somehow and let somebody take on the debt. That's the exposed view of fiscal space. And then, of course, it matters whether that entity that supposedly is coming up with the funding is already over indebted or not. Right? And if it's already over indebted, there is no space and there will not be anything forthcoming, like in some Southern European countries. If there's not that much debt in the beginning, then there is space and you can come up with more debt, like the Northern European country. I mean, I'm a bit painting with a broad brush, but that's the thing. So ex post, this is in a way an easy thing. Ex ante, it's much more difficult. If we are not yet in a crisis, but expect a pandemic like this one to be repeated, we may need such a fund again, maybe all the time. Then we have to think about ex ante fiscal space is something that you create. It's like a buffer that you build. It's fiscal ability that you do not use on purpose. It's unused fiscal debt, basically. Like a company in the corporate sector has always, if it's a well-managed company, a credit line, which is unused credit. And companies that go in default are those that have no credit lines anymore. Nobody gives them a loan in the future, nor at present, so they are going bankrupt. Countries need credit lines, and that's fiscal space, free, unused fiscal capacity. And that is something we are not yet really thinking about so openly, but that is, I think, the topic that will come on the European table, because if we want to have fiscal space at the EU level, which hasn't own resources at the moment, we either have to find an agreement among EU's members that we construct like a sovereign wealth fund only meant to exist in order to be used as a lending facility in a crisis, and we be refilled afterwards, a bit like the ESM. Or if we don't get there, we have to get to a sort of a fiscal union where all this wouldn't be needed anymore, which doesn't mean that there is more debt. It's just more legitimacy to not giving debt. Right? So, or to take more debt out there, but it has to be legitimate. There is a democratic process by which the budget is basically reaffirmed. And this is, I think, the big challenge, to design a mechanism by which fiscal space in the Eurozone develops, not only as the sum of national fiscal spaces, but as a fiscal space of its own. It is very challenging from an economist's viewpoint, because there must be, in the use of funds, conditionality. And Vivien said, we don't want conditionality. So there must be conditionality, otherwise it will never fly. There must be monitoring. There must be enforcement. All things that even today will not function within the realms of the NGEU, of the Next Generation EU Fund. But without it, there won't be a fund in the first place, because there's nobody willing to, except for those that know that they will be on the receiver end, to have such a fund. And second, there must be a financial viability of the scheme. So that means what I already said, buffer building. There must be a process by which this money is built before it's used. Right? And second, and that's the issue where I have no answer, but where I hope Vivien can help me, there must be political viability of the scheme. Political viability is not wishful thinking. We should have a fund, and it's great to have a fund, but it's how can you get such a fund when there is democratic legitimation needed in offering grants and loans to those that are suffering. Right? And I see this as the big challenge, to even devise that process of consensus building. So how can this be done? I think the discourse is starting, the political discourse is starting. It goes in the direction of a shared fiscal space, or fiscal coordination, you may call it. That's also all very well. But how this can happen, I have no idea. Can it happen without a treaty change? So that's where the law, where the legal side comes also in. But I think this is also the area of political scientists to ponder or to think about treaty change. How can it be possible? How can you do this? How can you get the agreement of everybody to such a new? How can you make it a Pareto improvement in an economic sense, rather than a one-sided distributional thing? And this, and that's my last word, in this section, it clearly touches on sovereignty of countries and legitimacy of such a common fiscal space. And that's where it's more a question mark here than that I would know. I can only talk about the impediments to having such a fund, which are these challenges of institution building, but not how you can overcome them.
So thank you so much, Jan. I watched the time and we have 15 more minutes, and I know you would love to just continue this debate. And I think we should really invite Vivien to say once we can meet in person again and continue the debate. At the moment, I would like to also engage the audience and pick up some of the questions. I will start with the questions that I addressed to Jan, so you have some time to think about responses. And then we have some questions to Vivien, but also to both. And Vivien, of course, when you respond to these questions, you are also welcome to pick and choose and also react again to what Jan just said. Of course, I know this is all a challenge in the remainder of time. So a first question we have from Matthias to Jan was whether there was not also a breakdown of the shadow banking system in 2020, and that the Fed had to intervene massively to stabilize it. So it's a bit about the crisis and what type of crisis we had and how it unfolded. Then we have a question from Sebastian Mack from the Jacques Delors Center in Berlin. Happy that you're in the audience. So he asks, banks received massive indirect support through fiscal and monetary measures, not only ECB, but also Fed, as mentioned by Matthias, as well as relaxed capital requirements. What is your outlook for the months to come? Will national governments again need to put taxpayers' money into struggling banks to safeguard financial stability, or can we trust into the EU crisis management framework and fully apply it? Then we have a question from Amy to Vivien. She asked whether you would be so kind and restate your point on whether it is a paradigmatic change we currently observe or not. She had the impression you were pointing to that, but also saying sort of with some caution, it's not permanent, it's temporary. So what are the criteria to sort of determine whether or not it is a paradigmatic change? I think that's a challenging one, of course. Then Aneta asks in the audience, also hello to you from our Vista network, whether you see any new important fault lines or cleavages emerging, both political and social, in the European political economy compared to the previous crisis, or would you rather say it plays out along the same fault lines or cleavages that we have seen and that we are familiar with? And Daniel Mertens was in our workshop, adds to that, related to Aneta's comment, that he thinks when we simply compare sort of COVID and the previous crisis as an economic crisis, we overlook to a certain extent what type of crisis we have, because he says the current moment is driven more than ever by the unfolding climate catastrophes intersecting with the pandemic challenge. And this involves that EU crisis responses this time try to solve many problems at once, which are counter-cyclical, digitalization, greening. How do you estimate such interweavings to impact the integration process? And then I end with the last one. If you had to choose to explain, that is by Demos Ianu, if you had to choose to explain the different responses to the crisis, was it more the fact that the great financial crisis was an asymmetric shock and the COVID crisis was a symmetric one, or that the EU authorities learned from past mistakes? So what is it more that you see here? I think these are all fascinating, challenging questions. And in the interest of time, you are free, and we have now sort of more than 10 minutes. That's not a lot to pick a bit what is most relevant for you. Vivien, I give you the floor with a reminder that we don't have a massive amount of time left. Thank you.
Yeah, so wonderful series of questions. I want to just respond to Jan very briefly before moving on to all of these questions. And I think, Jan, some of what you're doing is you're staying within the mindset that we've been in before. Simply the number of times you use the term debt And that's the main focus. And it seems to me that what we need to do is rethink the economic philosophy and actually quit talking about debt, when what we're really doing here is investment for the future. And of course, debt is a problem only if you don't grow. So long as you invest in growth enhancing areas like climate change, like digital, then paying back the debt is not the issue. It's how do you ensure that you get decent investment in the appropriate areas. So conditionality is also no longer about stick to the rules, don't have this, very high deficits or debts, but rather, it's about ensuring that your growth makes up for the investment. So it becomes a completely shift in mindset. And I think that's what's needed in the Eurozone in order for this actually to become a paradigm shift. One other thing on conditionality before I go on to the paradigm shift is that, I've heard lots of people, particularly in Northern Europe, continue to talk about moral hazard. I don't think moral hazard is a problem anymore. There's the ESM, and everyone knows what happens to you if you overspend, i.e. Greece, Ireland, Portugal, which of course was not overspending for the others. It was saving the private sector. So I think the banking issues are still really important here, but moral hazard isn't. So it's about thinking growth, thinking in order to have a shift. And here, so Amy's question about, is this paradigm shift or, and what I was really saying is it could be, it depends. It's about, is there a shift in the core ideas? If we think about paradigms, what we've already seen is a change in policies and a new policy program. But will that become permanent is the big question. You think about the next generation EU and this temporary resilience and recovery fund, for this to be a full paradigm shift, which we'll only know 30 years from now, looking back, is that if there's a permanent fund, if we get to a permanent fund with a serious EU budget, and that depends upon a lot of things. That depends upon Italy and Spain actually spending the money that they're getting appropriately, and that they demonstrate that this actually works, that they are growing. But how should we think about this permanent fund? It seems to me that this could be thought of as Jan mentioned, a sovereign wealth fund, but to invest as grants to all member states in education, training, income support, as well as greening the economy and digitally connecting people. But also arguably to invest in EU level cross-border endeavors. I think that's all really necessary to make it work. And then in terms of the questions about cleavages or it's not along the same fault lines, because actually this is a different kind of crisis. This is a climate crisis and a COVID. This is a health crisis. So it is a symmetric shock. But again, this depends upon, you think about the early days, there were still discussions, again, in Northern Europe about it being asymmetric. And it was really only Macron and Southern Europeans that enabled that shift to happen. Although arguably it's even auto manufacturers in Bavaria who talked about the need for Italian suppliers in Lombardy to continue to exist and to supply. So there's a lot of economics, enlightened self-interest, if you will, but also a different kind of crisis that's equally humanitarian and climate, et cetera. So I guess the question for Europe really is, how does it move forward? And is it going to take this great leap forward, which it has begun? And this is all in the realm of ideas. This is all in the realm of convincing national publics, as well as national leaders in some cases, that this is really the only way for the EU to address the challenges of the present and the future. Well, I guess I'll stop there.
Thank you, Vivien. I had two more comments also in the chat on fiscal space. So sort of in defense of conditionality by Paul, that conditionality can create political consensus and hence fiscal space. So conditionality not being bad per se. And there's also from the wider audience a comment whether the ECB as an epistemic actor could not create a narrative for a new kind of fiscal space. I leave that just to sort of address it, and I think that's food for further thought, but I would now pass it on to Jan to respond, as we have 4 minutes to go. I mean, we can go slightly over time, but...
Yeah, I'll focus my comment on what Vivien said, which I liked a lot and find it very interesting. So you said I use the word debt so often. I have to say you use the word ideas so often. So if I may, a bit on a very broad brush, say it's a bit idealistic what I hear from you, and I feel materialistic in that sense by looking at the basics of economics, which is the most basic is finance. I see this as the underlying discipline of all our thinking, and that is the instrument that is typically the one that is the arm's length relationship which governs Europe. Right? So equity is a fine dream, but that is the reality. And I cannot see that we get anywhere beyond that. So that's the materialistic view, in my opinion, is that no investment for the future, no green investment and so forth will, in the end, put away with the fact that somebody has to put up the money, not consummate and do it for something else, invest it. And that has to be well done. You said moral hazard is yesterday's thinking, and I fear it's tomorrow's thinking also, because to take exactly the example that you were using, there are now plans being made by governments that they use the money for green and digital. I mean, this is a lie. Who believes that? Who trusts that these countries spend the money that they receive in addition to additional green or digital funding? That's very unlikely. It's much more likely that they put, like the German government, for instance, and many other governments, the German government said this openly, we book our already decided budget positions that you can paint green and say this is green, we book it against the fund, the means of the fund. And so we have fulfilled our obligation. This is, of course, cheating, you could say. And another word is moral hazard. And that's exactly what we would say. The NGEU will create big moral hazard, not small. And to believe that moral hazard is over because we all follow a good idea, that's what I would call idealistic. And I'm really a materialist in that sense. I think the world, when it comes to finance, is very much looking at its own interest and only at its own end. There is no generosity in finance. And so we better, understanding what's going on and planning for the better future, we better anticipate this and make our institutions basically moral hazard proof. That was my earlier statement. We should think deeply about the design and give it legitimacy, so that it will not be vetoed when it's getting in the water.
Thank you, Jan. I think it would maybe be impolite not to give Vivien the chance to briefly react to, of course, this provocative statement that you're a bit too idealistic. So Vivien, if you want to briefly conclude, and then I wrap up the session. Thank you.
I think, Jan, you're absolutely right. Perhaps I am a bit too idealistic, but possibly you're a bit too materialistic. And so while I will take on board the importance of tremendous vigilance, and here we're talking about the European semester and ensuring that the Commission actually pushes back against Germany, saying, wait a minute, this is, you're not really doing serious investing in green and digital the way in which you could and should have. I mean, when we talked, you mentioned fiscal space before. And of course, part of the problem during the whole Eurozone crisis is countries with the fiscal space, countries without the fiscal space could not invest, and those with the fiscal space did not invest. And the result is the EU as a whole, and member states, are in dire need of serious projects in terms of infrastructure, in terms of, crumbling tunnels, but also crumbling digital, including in Germany, let alone in Italy, where I'm sitting right now. So investment is, and so, no one ever cut their way out of debt. They always grow their way out of debt. And you can see what's happened in Southern Europe as a result of the kinds of policies during the Eurozone crisis. So it seems to me that when I mention ideas, I'm talking about changing the mindset. So I agree debt is a problem, but only if you don't have growth. So there need to be new instruments. There needs to be new thinking, new EU-owned resources to do much more to try to create a kind of, a sense of the EU as a whole, as well as changing the mindset that leads in all countries to well, I guess, growth, investment for growth. But I think the only way you can do that is to have a permanent fund that ensures greater solidarity generally, and that is not perceived as solely going to Italy and Spain, but rather is seen as providing money for projects that actually help the shift toward addressing the climate change issues, toward addressing inequalities. But, it's very early days, so I agree. I may be completely naive, or at least too optimistic and too idealistic. But I think the problem with the materialist approach and this sort of drilling down on it's all about debt, I think it destroys maybe the courage and the imagination to make a paradigmatic shift. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. The conversation is going on in the chat. We have many more questions, which shows we have to meet again and reconvene and continue this discussion, and maybe in a few months to see whether it is indeed a new beginning of what and what kind of change we see. So thank you so much to both of you for joining, taking out time in your busy schedules. Thank you for the audience for engaging, and apologies we could not address all of your really challenging and extremely interesting questions and comments. I've put down all of them, and I'm happy to share them also with the panelists. And I hope to see you I think we reconvene in 15 minutes. No? And we continue straight on now. Okay, sorry. So we will just continue and pass over to the next slot before, I guess, we have a decent lunch break. So thank you again to Vivien and Jan, and hope to meet you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, for a very nice leadership in this debate. And Vivien, yes. Thank you for your comments. I have so much more to say, but we do this in another chat. Maybe
we'll have to continue this discussion another time. Yeah, thanks, Jan, and thanks, Sandra.
Well, thank you all. I'm afraid that the very last part, the last 10 minutes today, will be way more boring than this fascinating discussion. I have been charged with some farewell words, wrapping up some of the discussions, and I still hope to provoke some thoughts for you on your way back. Well, back this time maybe not physically, but maybe back to your lunch break. And I will keep it short. I have a short presentation, and let me hopefully it works. Sometimes it seems to be more difficult. Anyway, it should work this way. Now, my remarks in this presentation are kind of an outsider perspective, because my work over the last decade or so was mainly on emerging economies. So I'm listening, reading to these discussions, but I don't participate a lot, and therefore I don't think it's adequate if I make any kind of summary of our discussions during the last days, because I would certainly miss the nuances of the important arguments. I would rather focus on what was missing from my perspective from our debate, and I will do so with some very broad generalizations. So I will certainly do injustice to individual contributions. Some of the things that I will complain about in the next 5 minutes, I think have taken care of by individual participants, but still I think I would like to make some general points. Let me start with the first day when we were discussing about capital markets and banking union. From my perspective, I have to admit, I had the impression that the discussion sometimes was a bit what I would call European Union technocratic. So there was a lot of attention to very specific regulatory issues, to certain agencies and their competences, to specific institutions, to theories of governance, maybe also minor institutional change. Most of the debate was on the European Union level. Now, for me, I think it would be very important to link these debates, at least from my very strange perspective, a bit more with the effects that the changes on the European Union level with regard to the capital market unions, with regard to the banking union really have on the member state economies, maybe not only on the banking system, but then also on the economies in a broader sense. I would also like to see a bit more of the interaction between, let's say, these European Union level, maybe technocratic ideas with member state politics and societies, because, well, on the European Union level and in the technocratic sphere, you can do a lot of these kind of institutional changes and so on. But for, let's say, major decisions, you would still need this linkage to member state politics, to the societies. And finally, this is something I will come back to. A typical backside of a somewhat more technocratic discussion is that there is a very limited discussion of normative concerns. There's a, let's say, assumption that everybody is in the same side here, and we agree on generally what has to be done. And it's mainly about, let's say, the technical options, how this can be best achieved. But I think this is a dangerous tendency, and I think we should reflect our normative concerns sometimes a bit more explicitly. And this came sometimes in the discussion, so I was very happy about this. Well, not to blame always others. I can take our own paper as an example. When we were working on a very close reading of the existing literature on reform of economic monetary union, and we are summarizing this, and we have identified our points based on this literature. And then there came questions, where is the politicization, where's public opinion, where's legitimacy? And I think these questions were really to the point. And I think indeed, our reading of the literature is certainly part to blame on us that we did not recognize these shortcomings. But I would also say it's part of the literature that these issues play maybe a bit too limited role, or maybe we misread it. That would be the alternative option. Now, on the second day, and at first I wanted to make this remarks generally, but then I had to change my my tack, because on the second day I think many of these issues, these charges do not work. The discussions on fiscal solidarity take up these issues. They try to link our debates on the European Union level to what people in the European Union are thinking in the societies. But still, my impression is that there is also some shortcoming, that there's a limited linkage of these, let's say, these fantastic surveys to domestic politics, to domestic party systems. Because, I mean, maybe you have, for example, in a survey, a majority for more fiscal solidarity in the European Union, or some very encouraging signs. This still does not mean that you will have a political majority in powerful European Union member states, that the parties in power share these issues, pick up these issues, invest political capital in these issues. That's why I think also this is, for me, extremely interesting work on fiscal solidarity and surveys maybe would need to be linked up a bit more with specific political processes. And I know, of course, that some of you are doing this right on. I would also be interested to see more, but this is, of course, much too early at the moment, to see more what effects fiscal solidarity has. All of these common funds that are being spent. I mean, Vincent has moved a bit in this direction, but of course, this is still very limited. I would really see whether fiscal solidarity really makes a difference in the member state economies, how it interacts with different types of growth models. I think the interactions are quite different, and I don't think that we sufficiently reflect in many of our discussions that the member state growth models are very different and need very different things. And I was very happy to see this in the last discussion that this was mentioned. We can't do this at the moment because much of this new fiscal solidarity has not been disbursed. But of course, what we could study maybe is the impact of on the conditionalities, whether there is some interaction, and this is something that we can do now. For the rest, we have to wait a couple of years. Now, so generally, my plea would be to link discussions on reforms of economic monetary union a bit more with comparative politics, political party systems, but also with comparative political economy. I think this has been taken up and is being taken up much more to do not assume that there is one European economy or that there's one economics, but that there are institutionally very different growth models in the member states, and that you cannot generalize, that you always have to look how do European Union reforms interact with one economic model or the other. And I would also like to see a bit more engagement with political theory. I mean, we have seen this a bit via our colleagues from law yesterday. I like that a lot, because I see, and this is my last slide on these kind of issues, that there is, from my perspective at least, there's a general bias nearly in all contributions to the workshop. There's a fundamental assumption that the European Union is stable, generally works well. Of course, there's many things to complain about. And I think there's also a widely shared pro-integration outlook. So my impression was that nearly every contribution assumes that we should implicitly assumes that we should increase the power of the European Union level, that more transfers via the European Union is good. I mean, Jan showed some disagreement on this, and maybe some others. But generally, there's a very pro-European Union integration bias, I think, in this community of scholars. And I wonder whether this is whether we fare well with this. I mean, on the one side, not everybody shares these issues. The Brexit decision, I think, was inconceivable to most people in this European Union expert community, in the European Union scholars community. I think that the COVID crisis will have a lot of nasty surprises for us. It certainly increases inequalities within the member states, between the member states. I'm very sure that right-wing populists over time will exploit this. And I think they will also point at the European Union for this. So I'm not so confident that we can be based on this assumption of a fundamental stability of the European Union. And of course, I would like to see more reflection of normative assumptions. Is centralization on the European Union level really always better? For example, if we look at the economic diversity in the member states, and if we look at the democracy in the member states. So if you ask me, and of course I'm an outsider, and most of you will not share this, but if you ask me for the way forward, I would like to see more reflection on these issues. Now, to thank on a more positive note, time is up. I would like to finalize my comments on a big thank you particular to Sandra and Vincent. I mean, they had the idea for those workshops. They have set up the whole structure. They have invited the people. They have made all the decisions. So thanks to Sandra and Vincent, this is really your work. I'm also extremely grateful to the presenters and discussants, and of course, particularly to the both presenters and discussants, Adrian and Lucia. That was a tremendous job. We were very pleasantly surprised how many of you were willing to join us today. That was really fantastic. Great setup in the workshop. I'm also very grateful for those that have been discussing with us, Jan and Vivien, Christian, Daniel, and Claudius for sharing. And last but certainly not least, this was, I think, based on a perfect organizing, technical support. And Daniela Dimitrova was responsible for this. So thanks a lot. And I would like to close and wishing you a nice day, a nice lunch break now, first of all. And I hope to meet you, hopefully in person. Admittedly, I have to say I'm a bit fed up with Zoom conferences. I may say this now, in the near future. So take care and have a nice lunch break and a nice summer. Bye.
Thank you, the very same.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Merci. Ciao, ciao. Thank you.